Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Masage. I'm the Practice Director for BI at Ironside. And today's Take 30 is going to focus on Cognos Upgrades. What our approach is and what best practices are from our perspective. In terms of the agenda, we're going to do some intro. We're going to give you our point of view, our lessons learned, if you will. We're going to talk about planning for the upgrade. We're going to talk about content rationalization, performing the actual upgrade, validating and remediating your content, and then some proven practices and gotchas. We're going to have Q&A at the end, but if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them into the question box and we will address them. So 50% are on 11.1, 40% on 11.0, and then the remainder on 10.2. Okay, thanks very much for taking the poll. So first, as always, I want to start off with a reminder of the calendar of events. So today we're focused on Cognos Upgrades. Next week, we're going to focus on a deeper dive into dashboards and data modules, which should be interesting. So a couple of other notes. So the Take30 101s are still available. Again, that's a 30-minute block of time where you can talk to us on Thursdays about just about anything, be it strategy, be it technical, anywhere in between. You can find out more about it on our Strategies for Success page. It's on the home page of the Ironside site. We're going to be launching a Take30 survey, an overall survey, soon, and you'll get that. And if you were a part of the Cloud BI Part 1 session, you can leverage the survey to direct, in addition to other topics, direct what you want the second Cloud BI Take30 to be about. Other good news, the Take30 sessions will continue through all of 2020. We're going to change up the format a bit. So Thursdays, we're going to have BI topics twice a month, and then data science and data engineering topics the alternating weeks. And Tuesdays, we're going to invite in our partners, people from the industry, our clients, to talk about their experiences or give us a deeper dive on a product. Okay, so today's panelists, so I introduced myself prior, so we've also got Susan Moss, she's the technical manager on the team, Bob O'Donnell, who's one of our senior BI consultants, and we've got Mark Flame, who's one of our senior platform consultants. Okay, so when it comes to lessons learned, based on our experience with hundreds of Cognos upgrades over the span of our existence, we've observed the following, things not to do, the pitfalls and lessons learned. So the first is upgrading content that is no longer useful to the organization, right? This isn't really helpful for anyone. It costs more, both in terms of time, dollars, and energy. You should address your content and make sure it's clean before you do the upgrade. Also, not optimizing for the upgraded platform, both from the perspective of architecture and performance, but also capabilities and features. So when it comes to architecture and performance, has anything changed about your user community that you need to address? Are there additional users? Has the workforce gone global? There are many things to consider here. Those are just a few. In terms of improvements to legacy functionality, you have things like custom controls now, you have full interactivity. So all the things you used to have to use JavaScript to try to do, that interactivity is built in. Those are just, again, two examples. And certainly on the next one, embracing new functionality, including dashboards, data modules, data sets, stories, and explorations. No doubt there are voices in your organization that call out for other tools. IBM has taken big steps with Cognos Analytics to move towards parity and sometimes move ahead of those other tools. However, we often see that many organizations fail to take advantage of this new functionality. Okay. Additionally, not considering new use cases, new personas, and new demands on your analytics environment, and not focusing on increased adoption, increased user value, and ROI. Okay. All right, in terms of planning your upgrade, we see these as being the big steps in doing that planning. So the first is readiness. Are you running supported operating systems? Are your databases, both the content store and reporting sources, are the versions you have for databases there supported? Are your drivers up to date, right? So if you wanted to use JDBC connections for things like data servers, you may need to install that, okay? This is also a great time to review your licensing needs versus your usage. Additionally, are there any features that you rely on that are deprecated in this new version? Next would be to consider the upgrade type, right? So there are several different ways that you can upgrade Cognos. There's the in-place, there's side-by-side, there's installing it on new hardware. This is also a great time to consider your component distribution. Is your architecture aligned with your patterns of usage? Is it a resilient architecture, right? Because again, this is a great opportunity for this, especially if you're buying new hardware for the upgrade. Okay. Timeline considerations, right? How should we approach the upgrade from a project perspective? There is the phased approach, which would be department by department or functional group by functional group, or there's always the big bang approach where everything gets done at once. Each of them has its own sort of risks and benefits. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit later. Validation remediation. So best practices strongly recommend that you validate your content after you do the upgrade. Now, while testing all your content is likely to be very costly and time consuming, depending on how much you have, you probably want to test at least a percentage of it. So what is the right percentage to test? When we engage with customers to try to figure that out, we think about a number of different things. So one would be, how has the content been developed? Has it been developed by a centralized team that's been using Cognos for a long time and follows proven practices and standards? Or the opposite is everyone an author? There's been no formalized training, no standards, right? The way we think about the percentage of validation is based on that, right? We would go, certainly if there's more variability in how things have been developed, we're gonna opt for a higher level of validation. Also, what should we expect for remediation, right? The more complex a report, the greater likelihood that it might fail validation and therefore need to be fixed somehow, right? We'll talk a little bit about what, if anything breaks, what typically breaks or how it breaks. Next would be training and enablement. So, as we have seen, each new version of Cognos offers new capabilities, right? How can you capture the ROI and deliver additional value, right? And you've made this investment in Cognos for likely years. So how do you keep that going, right? Another thing to think about is when you're moving from version 10 to version 11, we didn't see many folks respond to the poll that they were still on 10, but there are special challenges there, special considerations because the UI has changed. The good news there is that the UI did change a bit through a couple of iterations of 11, but things have settled down now. And certainly, I think it's an attractive interface, but it's going to be a change for people, so you need to consider that as well. And then the last thing would be communicate early and often to your user community, right? No one likes a surprise, especially when it is related to the system that they use to do their job and answer business questions. Okay, so content rationalization, we touched on this a little bit earlier. We believe that this is critically important. So again, content of little or no value increases the cost and effort associated with your environment and your upgrade. Keeping content around that no one finds valuable can be costly, both from a dollars and effort perspective, but also a perception perspective, right? So if you think about it from a landscaping curb appeal point of view, if you let your Cognos content get unruly, like the guy down the street who never mows his lawn, what are the users going to say about the value of the platform? Might they begin to suggest that they need a new tool because they can't find anything of value, or everything is old? That happens. So what we see off to the right here is actually an example of a rationalization exercise we did for a client last year. So in looking at their audit data, they had around 9,000 reports, and we just took a deeper look at that and filtered out reports that we thought from the 9,000 that were kind of suspect, right? So we took out report views because they really don't count because they have a base report. We filtered out the My Folders content because they felt that the users owned their own My Folders content. But then we took out reports that hadn't been run in 6 months and reports that had been run less than 10 times in 13 months. And literally we got them down, I think this is a 67% reduction, right? So you've got all this content that no one is really using or shouldn't be counted this way. That is, that's a set of content that you should look at and consider rationalizing. The other thing I want to mention here is our rationalization assessment, which we have further expanded since last year when we did this, the example I gave here. So we have the ability to identify reports that are duplicates. We have the ability to identify reports that have where the content has duplicate elements. So the same query across several reports, but the visualization is different. Content that doesn't meet specific standards. So let's say it's an organization that doesn't want to have reports that have hard-coded SQL in it, or outer joins, or JavaScript. We can identify those. Orphan content, so content without owners, without a package, and more. So it's certainly customizable to your needs as well. So I'll give one example. We had another client that strongly suspected that many of their users were leveraging Cognos as an ETL tool, if you will, right? And they wanted to curtail that behavior. So we worked with them to kind of establish a definition of what a report that fit that criteria looked like from a report spec perspective, and highlighted all of those. And they were able to go to that team and get those rationalized down and find better ways to do that. And then finally, the rationalization assessment allows, there's scripting that we've got to automate the cleanup once actions have been decided for the reporting content. Okay. So performing the actual upgrade. So these are the major steps, right? There are minor steps between them, but these are the big ones. So it's important to back up your content store and perform a full content store export. Perform content maintenance. So this, like leveraging the content store consistency check to make sure that there are no inconsistencies between the content store and external namespaces. Back up any customizations and the cog startup.xml. So starting in 11.0, might have been 11.0.6, IBM introduced something called preserve.txt. So this is a text file that you can add to, and it lists out all the different files that will be preserved in an over-the-top upgrade. The next thing you want to do is prepare the environment to configuration. So like do the installs, do the configurations, and then finally turn on the environment or turn on the services, and that will upgrade the content in the content store. Okay, so in terms of the content upgrade, validation, and remediation, which again is a very important step. So broadly, we've seen a 90 to 95% pass rate for content. The typical issues we see are the first one is a visual one, right? That's a phenomenon called pixel shift, where if you had a pixel perfect report, when it's upgraded, you will see some objects move a little bit, right? Move 3 pixels to the left or to the right. In most cases, this isn't a big deal. For most customers, it's not a big deal. In some cases, it is, where if they've got things aligned down to the pixel, and things move around a little bit, that can be problematic. So something to think about. The next is non-sorted list or unsorted list and crosstabs. So if you've got list and crosstab data containers where you have not defined a sort, the sorting can change, right, when it's upgraded. So certainly the best practice is to define a sort on both those types of objects. And again, this one, I think this one's more problematic, but again, it depends on the client. The next one is JavaScript that is pre-prompt API, right? We have seen some challenges there. So be on the lookout for that. Certainly Cognos 11 gives you a better way of managing your JavaScript. So we certainly advise you to take advantage of that, right? And take a look at your JavaScript and make sure that you are leveraging that functionality. So next item is to consider using an automated tool to test your content. You can do it, if you have a small environment, you could do it manually. We have done that in the case of a very small environment. If you've got, perhaps if you have under 100 reports you may want to use, or 100 reports you want to test, you may want to use Lifecycle Manager. So Lifecycle Manager is a free utility that IBM provides. It's been around for quite a while, probably at least 10 years. It's a tool that runs the content twice and then compares them. Once in the old, once in the new, compares the two, and will alert you to any differences. For larger implementations, we tend to use Modio CI. So Modio CI is free, imagine air quotes here, free with Cognos Analytics for 30 days. So again, we have used that tool in cases where we have a lot of content to validate for a client. It's a great tool, has a lot of features, and we definitely suggest using that if you have a lot of content to test. Another element here is to make sure that you are creating new objects, so new dashboards, new reports, new data modules, stories, etc., to test new functionality, to make sure that the new functionality in whatever version you're moving to actually works, right? Because the last thing you want is to roll it out and then have these great new features not work, right, and not provide additional value. So once you've done that, you certainly want to upgrade and validate your metadata, right? You want to do that as part of this entire process. And then the last thing is to make sure that you are keeping your user community up to date, right? Again, no one likes surprises, and Cognos is generally core to what people are doing. It's very important. So keeping them up to date along the way is going to help you be successful overall. All right, so let me pause here and take a question. So when comparing Cognos 11 with Cognos 10, do we need to consider server resources? So that's a good question. A good starting point is to consider if your existing infrastructure and configuration is still aligned with how your Cognos environment is being used. If your user community has grown, or if their usage patterns have changed since you last upgraded Cognos, you have the opportunity to get things aligned for this new rollout. Quite often, we'll do health checks for clients who are in this situation and find out that there are several configuration settings that can be changed to optimize performance, or additional dispatchers or gateways can be implemented to help with resiliency. Specific to, two things I'll mention here. So dynamic query mode is not new, but certainly you should consider using it in your future state. Data sets are relatively new. Both of these features have their own service within Cognos Analytics, and they both benefit from having more RAM, right? So when you consider server resources, certainly new hardware is going to be faster, and you need to think about features and how they're going to be used and what you intend to use, and then make sure that you align the server resources with those capabilities. All right, so thanks for that question. Okay, so in terms of proven practices and gotchas, if you will, I think earlier versions of Cognos, you need to think about it a bit more. Certainly in our experience, the bigger the gap in versions, the greater the risk, the greater the potential for risk for remediation. So I know one example where we worked with an organization that was on Cognos. I think a version of Cognos 8, I think 8.2, right? So before it went to 8.4, and that that was the level of effort there was certainly higher than a 10 to 11 or 11.0 to 11.1. And as a general statement, increased complexity equals increased risk. So that's in terms of the configuration. That's in terms of your content. It's just kind of a basic rule of things, right? So consider that. Conversely, try to keep it simple to the extent that you can. A great example of this is there are organizations who think who might be in a situation where they think they've got like one shot at the budget to do this and one shot at making a change, and certainly that is a real thing with certain organizations, and they might try to do the upgrade and switch all their data sources from compatible query mode to dynamic query mode at the same time, right? That's a rather risky thing to do. We did that for a client last year, but we did it in 2 phases, right? So first we did the upgrade, did the testing and validation, then we moved them from CQM to DQM and then validated again. That's the appropriate way to do that. Another thing here, certainly start with development, right? Start with a low risk environment. Have that experience, use what you learned there to update your plan for the next environment, be it QA or prod. If you are automating validation using a tool like Lifecycle Manager or Modio CI, make sure you are capturing appropriate prompt values in advance, right? You don't want to have to go find out what the right prompt is when you are in the throes of doing the validation, right? Because you might be leveraging resources that don't know what reasonable prompts are, what right prompts are. Notification services, right? So this one can save you some embarrassment. Just make sure that you are managing those appropriately as you do your upgrade. You don't want reports blasting out from the new or the old environment when you don't want them to, right? So considerations for my folders content. So certain organizations see my folders content as something the users own. They don't want to validate it. They don't want to test it. And if it breaks, that's the user's problem. Other organizations take a different approach, right? And want to make sure that all of that works as well. And then lastly, we believe it's important to identify a champion or evangelist as you go through this upgrade. So if you can identify someone like that, they can help you in, you can kind of team up with them to promote the new features of Cognos Analytics through a proof of concept exercise, right? So what that does is it'll, you've got a voice on, typically you're going to find a voice on the business side like this. They can help you market the success that you find there and broaden the adoption. And again, if it's a situation, you don't want to wind up in a situation where people people feel, you know, the perception out there is that Cognos is old and out of date, when in fact, you know, IBM has done a lot of development to make it competitive in the marketplace, and in some cases exceed the capabilities of others. Okay, so I will pause there. Or we can move on to the Q&A portion now. So let me see what we have for questions. There's a question about Big Bang versus phased. Which one should I choose? So Bob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of different factors that would go into making that decision. You know, how many versions are you moving from where you are now to where you're going to go? So if I'm going from a 10.2x to you know, the latest and greatest, I might want to do that in a phased approach, if that's something I can do. If it's just, you know, if I'm keeping up to date, probably less of a concern. How is your environment used? So are there ways to delineate your content based on user groups or business units or whatever, and then you can actually take sections of those and upgrade them? And you know, how many people are using it? I think one other thing too you want to consider is, do I have mission critical or regulatory reporting that needs to be put out there for some reason? That would help you determine whether or not you want to do a big bang. Because if you have something that has to run on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis and put aside for regulatory reasons or whatever, that's something you want to consider as well. So you got to take a look at I think more than the entire environment usage to make that determination.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Okay, so another question. If we're doing an in-place upgrade, how do we do a rollback if the upgrade fails at some point? So I don't know, Susan, Bob, Mark, any thoughts there?
I'll jump on that too. Yeah, so if you're if you're doing it in place upgrade, it is paramount that you do a backup of the server and then the content store, because you don't know if it's going to fail, where it's going to fail. So you want to be able to roll back the Cognos server to where it was before. And then you want to make sure that the content store itself has not been affected by the upgrade as well. So those are the two things. Am I missing anything, Scott? Anything else you can think of on that? Those are the two big things.
There's also an install log, right? So that keeps a log of what has transpired during the install. So that would give you a hint as to what might have gone wrong. So Susan or Mark, I don't know if you've got any thoughts as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. All right.
I got it right.
All right, let me see. We have another question here. Okay, so I heard that Transformer is still supported. Do I need to upgrade that? Upgrade that at all? So Susan, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so luckily Transformer is still being offered today. We still see quite some customers using Transformer. According to IBM, this undercover is no big change for Transformer. However, they did rebranding Transformer a little bit. So we still highly recommend you upgrade to the latest version. That give you kind of at least more same look and feel with the main BI product. So yes, we do recommend you upgrade to the new version.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susan. So we've got another question. So by default, upgraded reports have full interactive mode turned off. Is there a way to perform a mass update of all the reports to turn this functionality on?
Bob, I think you did this quite a bit, right? People like the new features, right? With this full interactive mode, right? You can do dynamic filtering. It's a cool feature. I mean, manually, yes, you can reset all the reports to whatever mode you want. But if you do have large amount of, report, let's say you have, 5,000 reports, you want to convert to this new mode, the best tool will be using SDK, right? SDK can go to your content store, updating pretty much every single report to convert to the new mode.
I would recommend being careful with that though, because if you do have HTML items in your report that have script tags, JavaScript, those will fail in interactive mode. So beware of your environment. And oddly enough, we have the ability to go through and tell you how many HTML items have script in them, which could help you. You'd have to go back and, to Susan's point, it might be a lot easier to change everything en masse and then go back and change a handful of reports back to the old mode than it is to go through and change them all. So a couple of options there.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. And we have one final question. So we have 11.0.13, and since the lockdown, everyone's working from home, logging in and running reports. Running reports have been challenging, and schedule reports are more likely to fail. What do you recommend? Recommend in terms of troubleshooting? So this is a little bit outside the scope of this presentation, and I think certainly we'd want to ask you some additional questions. So so for the attendee who asked that question, I very much recommend you sign up for a Take30 one-to-one, and we can spend some time talking with you about how to solve that problem. Okay, so we are 3 minutes over at this